President Bush gets out to meet the Hungarian people. He compliments their leaders on having the courage to face free elections. And he tells the Soviets to hurry along with arms control.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, reporting tonight from Budapest.
Good evening. George Bush talked very directly to Hungarians today about the challenge of changing their system. And while he was here in the Soviet sphere of influence, he sent a message to Moscow about arms control, which may, for a change, have caught Mr. Gorbachev off guard. However, Mr. Gorbachev responds, Hungarians have given the first American president ever to come here their respect and their friendship, though they wish he'd arrived with more economic assistance. First, here's our White House correspondent, Britt Hume.
The president took his campaign for change in the communist world to a university named for Karl Marx, the father of communism. A sign of change already made is that Marx's bronze statue was out of sight behind a camera platform as the president spoke of the new Hungary.
And this is partly possible because brave men and women have formed opposition parties, and this is possible because Hungarian leaders are going to show the ultimate political courage, the courage to submit to the choice of the people in free elections.
As a reward and incentive for reform, the president announced a modest economic program for Hungary, including a $25 million U.S. fund for free enterprise, favored treatment for Hungary in trade with the U.S., and encouragement for U.S. industry to invest here. Mr. Bush devoted part of his speech to a pitch for the conventional arms reduction plan he put forth at NATO in May.
We're working day and night to get a solid historic agreement to strengthen stability in Europe and reduce the risk of war. And we are determined to get it soon.
The Soviets are complaining the 3-year NATO timetable for those arms cuts is too fast. But as if to keep up the pressure on Moscow to accept the proposal, Secretary of State Baker had this announcement here today.
Tomorrow in Vienna, almost 2 months ahead of schedule, the NATO alliance will table specifics of that proposal.
Baker said the president is not trying to one-up Mikhail Gorbachev, but the administration would clearly rather have the Soviets than the U.S. saying not so fast on arms control. As for his visit here, Baker said the president is just trying to encourage, quote, homegrown reform. Mr. Bush was out today buying some homegrown produce and fishing in his pockets to pay for it himself. The peaches didn't cost much, and neither will the Bush plan for the economy here. That's partly because the U.S. Treasury hasn't got any spare money. And even if it did, foreign aid to a communist country, even a changing one, would not be Congress's idea of how to spend it. Britt Hume, ABC News, Budapest.
And so the president says he will do what he can to help make life better for Hungarians. Compared to a lot of other places in the communist world, it doesn't look all that bad to begin with. There are thousands of people here on vacation at this time of year, and no matter where they come from, they very often have to remind themselves, amid the beauty and the obvious plenty, that they're in a nation which has been pretty much run into the ground by communist mismanagement, as ABC's John Donvan discovered when he got around the corner.
It is easy to be seduced by the skyline of Budapest. Easy to conclude, if you're an outsider, that here among the cafes and the squares and the grand architecture must be a city of gracious living, and that the grace extends to all Hungarians. But the seduction ends when you reach the back streets. Here are the Hungarians married to a living standard that decays a little more every day, with inflation at about 20%. This is the Hungary where decent housing is almost impossible to find, and once it's found and the plumbing doesn't work, a plumber is hard to find. It could take a year.
There are many people in this country who are working 2 or even 3 jobs, and only so they can afford more than just the basics like housing and food.
Some senior citizens can't afford even those, and more have been caught shoplifting in the grocery stores. Officially, a quarter of the population is living in poverty. Yet there is luxury in Hungary. You see it window shopping, in the brand names of affluence that staked their ground here from the 60s to the early 80s. But not a lot of Hungarians can easily go in to buy, not unless they take the extra job or join the young men in the crowd trying to make money by changing money illegally. All this may explain why people here invested so much hope in the coming of George Bush and why they feel let down now that he's leaving.
25 million for boosting private business, it's really almost peanuts.
In the absence of major aid from the U.S., Hungary will have to continue relying on its own resources to get by. That means agriculture and more efficient manufacturing. And in the capital itself, tourism, which depends so much on that beauty that still seduces even as it deceives. John Donovan, ABC News, Budapest.
When President Bush leaves here tomorrow morning, he will go to Paris, where he says he will represent the Hungarian and the Polish cause to the other major industrial democracies at the weekend's economic summit. The Japanese will be there, of course. The Japanese have said today they will present to the summit a $43 billion package for cleaning up the environment and helping the very poorest countries. On the surface, it sounds like a massive contribution, which may overshadow whatever the president wants to accomplish. ABC's Barry Dunsmore is already in Paris.
No one could accuse the Japanese of coming to Paris empty-handed. It would appear that Prime Minister Uno's wallet is bulging. The Japanese proposal has several key elements. $35 billion for development in the world's poorest countries, another $5.5 billion to help poor countries refinance and stretch out their existing loans, and more than $2 billion for environmental protection projects. French President Mitterrand this evening played host to the leaders of many of the world's poorest countries who are in Paris for the French bicentennial celebrations. Word of the Japanese aid package had got around.
Well, I certainly welcome such news. And in fact, I would like to express here again my heartfelt gratitude to the Japanese government.
With human rights and human poverty, themes of tonight's spectacular at the bicentennial, the Japanese have seized the opportunity to emphasize their role as the world's largest aid donor. This is a role which has been urged upon them by the U.S.
This is one way, that is through assistance with the third world, that they can share responsibility with us and with other Western industrialized democracies.
Cynics might say that the Japanese Prime Minister was merely trying to deflect attention away from his sex scandal at home, or that the Japanese often don't reveal the period of time and the strings attached to such grandiose projects. But the fact is that foreign aid is one more area in which the Japanese are way ahead. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, Paris.
Just one other note from Paris. Two fugitive leaders from China's pro-democracy movement showed up in public there today, their first public appearance since fleeing Beijing. Wer Kai-shi and Li Lu are both wanted by the Chinese government for inciting rebellion. Today they appeared at a ceremony to unveil a replica of the so-called Goddess of Democracy statue, which the students had erected once upon a time in Tiananmen Square. Later in our broadcast from Budapest, we'll see how free enterprise is helping to dispose of the Iron Curtain. In a moment, Diane Sawyer in New York will have the day's other news.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings in Hungary.